Good morning, good morning. Good morning. My name is Colonel Christian Patterson, and I am the 12th Commander of the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center, otherwise known as ERDC. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all in attendance today as we celebrate this great milestone in our organization's history, the 25th anniversary of ERDC. Would you please rise for the playing of our national anthem? At this time, it is my honor to welcome to the stage our Deputy Director, Ms. Pat Sullivan.
Good morning, ERDC family. Good morning. This is a great day to be a member of the ERDC family. What a historic event as we celebrate ERDC's tradition of innovation for its first 25 years. How many of you were here 25 years ago? Oh, great. Good show of hands. Wonderful. Welcome to our ERDC team members joining us both in person and virtually, and a warm welcome to our distinguished guests from the city of Vicksburg and Warren County, our state representatives, and other representatives for the Mississippi delegation of Congress. It is also such a treat to see our former commanders and directors, all of whom played such a vital role in ERDC's success over the past 25 years, and you'll be hearing from some of them today. And everybody stay tuned, as we will be hearing from a very special guest at the end of our program today. I think you'll be very pleased. Today, we celebrate an important milestone in the history of the U.S. Army Engineer Research and Development Center. 25 years ago, our then Chief of Engineers, Lieutenant General Joe Ballard, issued the official order to merge 8 individual R&D laboratories into one cohesive organization to better serve our stakeholders and our nation. We couldn't have done that successfully without a tremendous legacy of expertise from those individual laboratories and a willingness to come together for the good of USACE and our nation. Today, we have an opportunity to hear from some of those who were involved in ERDC's formation and its first 25 years of success, years that we will continue to build upon over the next quarter century and beyond. At this time, I would ask the participants for our first panel session to take their places on the stage. Joining us this morning are Dr. Robert Whalen, the director of the Waterways Experiment Station from 1985 to 1998, Dr. Barbara Soderin, the director of the Cold Regions Research and Engineering Laboratory in 1998. And joining us virtually, we will have Dr. Bill Roper, who was the director of the Topographic Engineering Center, the predecessor to our Geospatial Research Laboratory in 1998. And he was unable to join us in person, but he will share his thoughts with us through video. Dr. Mike O'Connor, who was the director of the Construction Engineering Research Laboratory in 1998, was scheduled to be with us, but he's a little under the weather today, so we wish him a speedy recovery. Our moderator for today's panel discussions is Mr. Tim Reeves, who's a member of our ERDC Corporate Communications Office. Let's give our first panelist a round of applause, and Tim, the microphone is yours.
Ma'am, thank you so much. And if you ever want to know what traveling around with the Rolling Stones must have been like, following these panelists and the ones in the second one has been quite a joy. So thank y'all for joining us today. Thank y'all for participating. And as we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the day the order was signed to create ERDC, any day like this is built upon the history and the legacies that were previously established. For each of our panelists, starting with you, Dr. Whalen, can you talk about the laboratories you managed and the capabilities they had established prior to ERDC's merger?
Well, that's an interesting question. And contrary to popular belief, I wasn't here at the end of World War II.
I'll make that note, sir. I'll make that correction.
But that's where I'd like to start, with the fact that we, the U.S., drastically decreased our military capability after World War II. And the next big event was Sputnik. And so the Russians put up the first satellite in 1958, and that spurred all sorts of activity, as most of you know. We formed NASA, we got President Kennedy announced the race to the moon, and the supply of engineers and scientists was
I got it.
almost, the supply of engineering and scientists was almost non-existent. And so what happened is a great time to be looking for a job, because starting salaries were going up at about 15% a year for, almost a decade in the early 60s and 70s. Well, each surface proliferated everything, and so labs sprung up all over the nation. And I guess the first attempt to really get a handle on dollars was Mr. Carter's Planning, Programming, Budgeting initiative. Then in the 80s, DOD decided we had to consolidate some of these labs. There were about 60 things that called themselves laboratories in the 80s. And that's obviously more than we probably needed. So there was a big consolidation effort. Lots of great stories that we can talk about offline.
I'm going to ask you some online.
During that time. And so there was a Air Force Research Lab out of, I don't know, a half dozen or more of their laboratories centered around. And that's when the missions really got sorted out somewhat. And so the formation of ERDC was preceded by this consolidation of many DOD labs and things. So during that time, what the capabilities at the Waterways Experiment Station, what the labs that were here at this location at the time, we had kind of garnered the mission of blast and shock effects, weapons effects, projectile penetration, all that good stuff. Built some great facilities. We also had the airfields and pavements research. The Air Force kind of thought they ought to have that, but I told them we'd been doing that ever since they were part of the Army. So we won that argument. And we'd formed a major supercomputer center. We had one of 4 supercomputer centers in the Department of Defense, all with about the same capability at the time, and ERDC's done a whole lot more after that. So, and we had the environmental quality research capability. So that's kind of what led the capabilities that led up to the consolidation at ERDC. So consolidation wasn't any thing unusual, I guess is the point I'm trying to make. Plus the fact that the Corps of Engineers has relocated its Coastal Engineering Research Center, which was at Fort Belvoir, down here to Vicksburg, and we ultimately combined it with a hydraulics laboratory, much to the consternation of, of a few individuals.
It would seem that there's been some consternation runs through that whole theme for that period.
That's true.
So.
That's the point I'm trying to make. So I think that's all for start things off.
Dr. Soder, and your mic may be working, I don't know.
Yes,
Yes, we're good.
Oh, okay, you can keep that. Okay, hi, I'm Barb Soterin. So I was the director at Krell in 1998. I came from the Navy, from the Naval Ocean Systems Center, which was quite a big laboratory, and did Arctic research for about 15 years. So when I came to Krell, I knew about Krell, of course, but I was quite surprised at how focused and how small it was. So Krell was the smallest of all the labs, and we had a lot of facilities to maintain. And of course, in the 90s, Russia became our friend. So the Arctic was not the high priority that it used to be. So we were nearly broke, but we had a great team. So we did research in the Arctic, a lot of climate change when that was originally beginning. We did frost effects research, we did ice engineering, we did some microbiology, we did some chemistry, we did mobility and road construction. So we were quite diverse, but really focused on cold regions and what that did to the processes and the effects. So when ERDC was announced, of course, we were a little intimidated.
And I guess we want to get Dr. Roper's comments, which I know we recorded in advance.
Okay, well, first off, I want to thank you for hooking me up to the meeting today and be happy to talk about some of TEC's activities. We, of course, are very heavily involved in the communication, development, and execution of topographic and geospatial intelligence information to the Army in the field. During the time leading up to the establishment of ERDC and a few years after it was in place, we were very busy. We doubled our classified program with a number of DoD, intelligence agencies, and private sector companies, almost entirely in the classified area, leveraging our very large SCIF here at Tech. We started 2 researchers on their roll to a PhD, which was an area I was interested in improving for Tech. and we had a plan to go to 5 more in the next 2 to 3 years. We responded to Hurricane Mitch during that time, which was a catastrophic hurricane in Central America. We were able to provide near real-time imagery to the DoD forces that were going in for the rescue on their way in. We have a very close connection to the National Reconnaissance Office and some of their facilities that link in with tech. During that time, we also had, for tech, a kind of an interesting first. One of our researchers got a patent on an innovative way of understanding tidal conditions between tidal gauges along the coast of the United States and in the Great Lakes. So those are just a few of the things. We did also have a project where we had a mobile downlink that had worldwide communication capability set up and tested as a field site at Tech, and had a heavily instrumented Gulfstream jet, a joint project with the private sector, several DoD agencies and Tech, to look at hyperspectral, LiDAR, and several other instruments to test that as a platform for advanced research. It was actually used later to image over the towers that came down in New York for thermal imagery, hyperspectral, and LiDAR. Those are some of the things that were underway. It was a very exciting time, actually, leading up to the merger. And I'll have to say to everyone that I thought Ed Lake's decision to go ahead with this was the right one. And I think it's turned out to be a tremendous success.
And this is where I get in trouble, because I'm going to go off script for a second. But Dr. Whalen, I'm not going to let you get away without telling a story you told me earlier on the phone last week. We'll keep it to the presentable presentation, right? But tell me the story about, sir, when you came to Wes, and how that kind of mentality forged your leadership in what was Wes was going on at the time.
Well, now, I'm not going to admit.
Oh, here, don't forget this.
I'm not going to admit to that forging my leadership. One individual, I guess what you need to know as background to this is that the program at Wes, and probably still today, is about 2/3 reimbursable. So it's somebody else's money. So we write proposals and stuff, and so that developed a very entrepreneurial culture. And well, you got to also understand when I came here. I came here in 1967, and one individual told me, says, this was not too long after I got here, said, Whalen, says, this is a great place. Said, you can do anything here that you got the guts to go ahead and do. Said, and what he meant was, if you write proposal and get money,
You got it.
there you go. And but he said it in a little bit more colorful language than I use.
Well,
but
the good news is, sir, is I won't be doing the second panel, so that's good. Dr. Soderin, the next question. What do you remember about the days leading up to and immediately following the order creating ERDC?
Chaos. So at the time, Krell did a lot of basic research, and we were very proud of it. So we had money from the National Science Foundation, and one of their biggest experiments all time was international experiments in the Arctic, and the chief scientist was from Krell. So, you know, we figured we were on the map. And why did we need the other labs? You know, we were focused on cold regions. We were doing very well in 6.1 in basic research. We had a lot of publications. Anybody that worked in the Arctic or cold regions knew about Krell. But we didn't have a lot of money. So as I said, you know, the wind sort of went out of the balloon in Arctic research. So I figured maybe by combining with ERDC, you know, they'd float us again. Of course, that didn't work. We were still responsible for all our facilities and keeping our people funded. I mean, what the heck? What were we getting? So a lot of the people at Krell were not anticipating a big celebration in coming together in ERDC. But about half the lab was. So during the first year, I was quite surprised when I went around and talked to people about actually how many projects, albeit small ones, how many projects we had with the other labs. So we figured if we grew those, you know, if we understood better what the capabilities across ERDC were, you know, maybe we could get in under their coattails. So it was intimidating because we were the smallest and Wes was this big behemoth, you know. Searle and Tech were our competitors. So the response at the lab wasn't what I would call positive. But, you know, in hindsight, I think it worked out really well. I think people are coming to accept it. Still working on it.
Still working on it.
We got to retire a few more people, you know. Because they did have this very individualistic niche that was identified with Krell.
Well, fantastic. And we got Dr. Roper's comments on this question as well.
Well, there's always concerns when you make major changes. I think the concerns that many of the folks had was that there may be a complete redistribution of authority. Of course, to a degree that happened, but it was done in a way that provided everyone the opportunity to provide input. The folks at Tech did that. And I think some of the other labs were perhaps more affected or impacted by the changes, but my position was to embrace this change because it was the right thing to do. We were in a very competitive situation with the other Army labs, and we were too fragmented to really compete with them in some ways. And the Waterways Experiment Station was probably in the best position to compete. They had the bulk of the laboratories at that time, but we were stronger as a total new organization than we would have been if we remained separated. We also hosted a number of meetings in the process of setting up ERDC. I guess in some ways we were more centrally located to all the labs at that time. But anyway, they were sometimes a little contentious, sometimes very productive. And I think one of the areas that worked out reasonably well in the end to everyone's satisfaction. But anytime you do something like this, it's going to cause issues, but we worked through them.
Dr. Whalen, he kind of alluded to a little bit of it, but one of the main reasons for bringing the laboratories together was to create more cross-laboratory collaboration, making it better and more efficient for our customers. Before ERDC was created, what did collaboration, if any, look like between the laboratories?
Well, probably much to everybody's surprise. Probably much to most people's surprise here, there was a good deal of collaboration among the laboratories. In fact, all of the civil engineering laboratories met twice a year. The directors and technical directors met twice a year for a period of probably 5-6 years in the late 80s, early 90s time frame. And that was Naval Civil Engineering Laboratory out at Port Hueneme, of course, Wes and Corral and ETL, and the Coast Guard lab met with us also. So, and the reason we did this was, I'm not sure who started it. I don't think it was me, but I honestly don't remember whose idea it was to do that. But we did meet. We rotated the location of the meetings around, and getting together every 6 months, we knew what one another were doing, and so there was quite a bit of collaboration before that. At least that's my perspective.
Ma'am?
Thank you.
Ma'am?
Well, as I said, there were some projects we had, civil engineering kind of things. But because we were really focused on cold regions and basic research, we didn't have a lot of interaction with the other Corps of Engineer labs. We had a lot of interaction with university labs and mostly university labs. But there were opportunities. So once the folks started looking, I think they saw a lot of opportunities. But before ERDC, we didn't have sort of the mandate or the emphasis to look to the Corps for additional collaboration. So that's one thing that ERDC brought to CREL that I think was very beneficial.
Ma'am, the next questions will start with you. It is understandable, and we've alluded to it a couple of times, there were some questions, maybe some confusions, concerns among the workforce in the individual laboratories as this decision was made and the merger was coming together. At your lab specifically, how did you help navigate your team through that transition into an ERDC?
Well, like I said, we needed to bring in some more research dollars. So we had some offsites, and we looked at other areas that we could focus on. We took a look at what the labs that the other labs across ERDC were doing to see if there was some opportunity there. And we identified some areas that people had expertise but hadn't really developed any proposals. So we focused more on, like, battle space environment was a big area at the time. So we focused more on battle space environment and physical processes. And people started to see the advantage of being part of a bigger organization with a mandate to collaborate. So I think they were more readily accepted at the other labs than they thought they would be. And that helped a lot. And then, you know, there was some consternation because we had, like I said, we had a lot of support and facility people, which were combined when ERDC started. All the support people were combined into one group that was not part of CREL. So then they thought, well, now these people are the enemies. But, but no, they're still here to support you. They're still going to do their job. They're still your friends. You know, nothing really has changed. So I think, you know, once we identified what their fears were and how to overcome it, I think that a lot of people were much more accepting to be part of ERDC, and they saw the advantage of it.
Sir, what about at West?
Well,
There you go.
contrary to what some people might think, I was a proponent personally of the consolidation, and we all have our own personal concerns, but I had kind of had 1 foot in and 1 foot out of West. I'd been offered to be the job of director of Army Research Laboratory, actually just before General Ballard's letter was issued. Most people, or probably nobody, maybe other than General Ballard, knew that, because it took a while for him to come through with my condition for changing jobs, which was the maximum relocation bonus. I told him, no bonus, no me.
I'm going to write that down for our T-shirts.
Anyway,
No
the
bonus.
reason was I was going to sell a house for about $120,000 and buy one for maybe $300,000+. So, and there was no increase in salary, because at the time salaries were all compressed down to about the lower GS-15 level. Everybody made the same amount of money except for the geographical difference in salaries. So I mean, from my way of thinking, there was good reason for that. But so anyway, things worked pretty well, I think, and I think Dr. Link and others steered things really well in consolidating the resource management, the lawyers, the auditors, everything on that point. You'll hear a lot about that in the next panel, I'm sure.
Sure.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. And we've alluded to it a little bit too, is a merger of this magnitude could not have been pulled off without the leadership of the lab directors and their buy-in, which you, Dr. Soter, you've mentioned. What kind of discussion, if you can kind of bring us into the room a little bit, did that group of lab directors have once the merger became clear, once this was going to happen? And what sort of problems were some of the first problems y'all had to work through? Dr. Soter?
Well, I think one of the first things that we were directed to do was to meet together. It was quite often, once a quarter or once a month. It seemed like once a month, but it might have been once a quarter. So we'd all meet together to discuss sort of the future of ERDC and where we were going and what the mandate was, what the issues were, how we could better collaborate and work together. So we had the opportunity to visit each of the sites, and that was exciting when everybody came to Krell, because, up in New Hampshire, nobody came to see us. And I think we were all surprised at the level of capability and the diversity in the research, the plethora of facilities, and, just the strength of that organization. So I think after we did visit each of the sites, then we were picking a neutral place like Tennessee. So we didn't have to travel quite so far because the labs were hard to get to. So it took quite a while, except for Washington. We all could have gone to Tech.
Well, I would be curious to know, is when y'all first came together after the order was signed, is what was the first, over coffee, can't believe we're going to do this, or, or what are they thinking, or those type of things? Is what was the first, item on the agenda list?
I think most of our questions initially were to do with the support areas. So we had been an independent lab. We had supported those people. We knew exactly what they were what they were doing and how things were running, how everything was managed. And now all of a sudden at Krell, a third of the people didn't belong to us anymore. And we were, so we had to work through some of those issues on how that was going to be managed and how we would still get the support that we had in the past, but it would be combined and you can learn from each other in those areas. So we did things a little bit differently at Krell, like in RM, and we could learn from the other labs on how to do them more efficiently and effectively. And then the other areas that we talked about, I know I talked to Mike O'Connor and Dr. Roper, was how do we maintain our individualistic identities? So Krell was a known name in cold regions, and we didn't want to lose that. So, I could come back to Krell and say, okay, we can still be Krell. We can still maintain that identity. But now we are under this umbrella. We're part of a bigger organization.
Dr. Whalen, I know you said you're 1 foot in, 1 foot out, but I think you left December of that year. But in those first few months leading up to the order and those few months that you were still here, what were some of the conversations you had in helping push that through?
Well, kind of the main thing was...
There you go.
The main thing we had to work out in a reasonably collegial manner was the consolidation of resource management, auditors, all of the support functions, and I'm sure you'll hear a much more articulate thing about that with the next panel. But from my personal perspective, it was inevitable that that there was going to be a consolidation of certainly some type and probably all of the labs. And that's why I gave the response to your very first question with the background of what was happening through the 70s and 80s and early 90s time frame. The Corps of Engineers wasn't going to survive sustaining what at the time was at least 5 laboratories, counting Wes as one. Anyway, so I don't know if many others shared that opinion, and I probably didn't express it.
Well, before you put your microphone down, sir, listen, I'm sure somebody's counting how many times I've had to hand it to you. But my question would be, how did you, or how did Vicksburg win the arm wrestling competition to host ERDC's headquarters?
I'm really not sure.
Okay.
And I don't think I was really super involved in that final decision. I'm not sure. Dr. Link can probably tell us in the next panel when that decision was made, but it may have not been made till after I was long gone.
I got you.
So,
Well, we'll go on to the next question, and I was going to say...
it's been a long time. I can't remember all this stuff.
Well, we can dial a friend. He's right there. Speaking of Dr. Link, in the stand-up ceremony in 1999, he might not remember having said this. He said, changing a culture that has served us well in the past, but may not have been the best for the future. He was talking about changing the culture of what was 8 separate laboratories into one ERDC was fine, but was not going to be best for the future. What is your thought on that comment? Dr. Soderman, we'll start with you.
I think I agree with what Dr. Whalen just said, is that, if you're small and you're self-sustaining, it's hard to make a go of it. So we were just talking about healthcare and how, the hospitals have all these facilities that they have to maintain and different standards, and it's hard, so they're all combining. And they're combining because the support activities are basically the same. They may have been executed a little differently, but the functionality is basically the same. So to have 8 individual organizations, although we always thought of WES as one, so they don't count. But we did things a little differently. And some things worked and some things didn't work. And because we hadn't been talking together, we didn't know. We were unaware of different ways of doing things. So once we came together, I think that was a good model, where the kinds of things that worked were discussed, the kinds of things that didn't work were put aside. And it was a change. It was a huge change at Crowell. But slowly, I think things consolidated and became one family.
Dr. Whalen, your thoughts on the...
Keep forgetting this thing.
Sir, if there's one job I've got, that's it.
I guess I don't really have a lot to add to that. As I said, I personally thought the consolidation was inevitable due to the stuff that was going on, consolidating labs all over DOD. And yeah, I think it was done pretty well, really. And I think it was done in a pretty collegial manner from what I saw. Of course, I wasn't personally here for really I guess the action time of actually putting it together, since I left in December of '98. But I think things work pretty well, and I think proof is here today of what ERDC is today.
Well, that leads me to my next question. As you do sit here today, what's the first thing that comes to your mind, or do you think about as we're marking this 25th anniversary?
Oh, well, I think it turned out just like I envisioned. I mean, it's a great organization, and there isn't any other organization quite like it, in my opinion. So, of course, I'm biased. You can't tell that, I know, but I think it's really turned out well. Well for the Corps of Engineers, well for the Department of Army and DOD.
Ma'am, your thoughts as you're sitting here today?
Well, I did have a couple comments on one of your previous questions.
Oh, sorry.
We would have been very surprised if the headquarters hadn't been in Vicksburg. You know, 5 of the labs were here. The headquarters is there to support the labs. There's no way it was going to be in New Hampshire or Illinois. We thought there was a chance it might have been in DC, because, you know, that's where the power and the action is. But really, the headquarters is there to support the labs. So we would have been very surprised if it had been anywhere else. And I think some of the decisions were congressional. You know, you guys have the support of your congressional representatives, and, you know, we had 2. You had 2, but you're a big organization. You've got the district and the division here. So the Corps has a huge footprint, and will be supported in the future as well. And I think it was supported back then. So at the 25th anniversary, you know, I was new to Crowell. So I came in, and 6 months later, we were ERDC. So I didn't really have the vision that Bob, you would have had on what it could have been, because we didn't know what the other labs were doing. We didn't know the capabilities. So at the beginning, I didn't have a vision for what ERDC was going to be. It was just day to day, how is this going to work? And you know, budget, and we thought we were going to have to pay for it. But that didn't happen. You had to pay for your own. But you could see the opportunities you know, if you thought about the Corps of Engineers and what it does, and you think about what the Army does, and all of the capabilities within ERDC and how we could support it, and other organizations. So as you pointed out before, a lot of the money is reimbursable. So considering the expertise and the kinds of things we bring to the table across ERDC, I think there's no doubt that it's a success and it will continue to be a success.
Well, we did have Dr. Roper's comments on this particular question.
I think one of the key aspects of their success is that it is now an integrated organization that brings to bear all of the capabilities of the labs in a focused and integrated manner to address both the Corps, the Army, and the nation's major problems. And I think there's some areas that ERDC can be a real plus to both the country and perhaps the world in the area of water. Now, water is kind of one of the black swans of the 21st century, and there's a real need for new technology, new collaborations, and new ideas on how to conserve, protect, and utilize the world's water. I'm talking mostly about drinking water, but also water that goes into the area of agricultural production. So I think the ERDC is well positioned to address those issues. I was really impressed from what I've seen of the expansion at Vicksburg. Your new headquarters looks phenomenal from the outside. I'm very interested actually in your activities that are going on now. Since leaving the Corps, I spent some time at various different places. I was professor and chair of civil and environmental engineering at George Washington University. I've now been with Johns Hopkins for, I guess, almost 15 years. And it's been fun to be in academia. I enjoy teaching, but I'm also still using geospatial intelligence. I teach a course in that, and I see that as a real important tool to the Army, and thinking about the critical role that geospatial intelligence plays in the battle space and preparing for characterization of the battle space. Really important to know what's around the corner, behind the building, over the hill, in the next city, as you plan out a campaign, or you, at the platoon level, move forward from your current position. So I don't apply that kind of technology anymore in those situations, but I'm more into planning for urban development, understanding environmental issues using geospatial intelligence, and also looking at next generation buildings, environmental sustainability, and a number of other things.
And before we close, I want to thank the audience here today and for their participation in this, and y'all's as well. And as we do our closing comments, we're going to start with Dr. Roper's first, and then we'll go Dr. Soder and then Dr. Whalen.
No, there is one comment, and that's Ed's decision was the right decision, strategic decision. There was another key decision that was made by the Army several years later after ERDC had been formed, and that was to form the Army Geospatial Center, which addressed many of the support functions that Tech had been doing. And that has evolved as the Army decided that there was a critical need for geospatial intelligence throughout the structure of the Army, and that has turned out to be very, very successful also. And I'm really happy to see that the R&D part of tech is now affiliated with the Army Geospatial Center. That's a good merit. But the importance of geospatial intelligence and the ability to remotely characterize the battle space, remotely plan the operations, and the key point is to also communicate that information to the operating forces in the field. And that's a key element that the Army Geospatial Center provides. I'm sorry I can't be there, guys and gals, but enjoy your get-together, and I'm going to be listening in on part of it, so thank you all, and you're on a journey. This is a new journey. It's you have the right people in place. You've got the organization. I think you'll do great things. So, thank you very much. Asians.
Ma'am, your thoughts?
Well, one of the things that I recall in 1998, before we became ERDC, the Army had a competition for Lab of the Year, and Krell won in 1998, which didn't help get the researchers on board to move into ERDC because we were already Lab of the Year. But I have to say that Jim Houston went on year after year to make ERDC the Lab of the Year. And there's a reason for that. The criteria was very rigorous and detailed. Looking across the plethora of information and expertise and how it was run. So ERDC was Lab of the Year. And I haven't followed it recently, but I'm sure we could win again.
Sir, before you start, if you ever want a great conversation with Dr. Soder on how a future in playing piano turned into a science career, this is an amazing career journey if you have a chance to ask her today. So
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Well, reflecting on how things are, number one, this is a great celebration, and I'm very pleased to be a part of it, and thank you for the invitation. Things probably have turned out about not too different from what I probably would have envisioned. Number one, due to the entrepreneurial nature of not just what used to be West, but the other Corps of Engineer laboratories too were very entrepreneurial. The Cold Regions Lab, I might mention a comment that was made about Corel to me. In a somewhat humorous way, he said, well, all those guys up there in Hanover and New Hampshire do is they take our research program here at West and put in cold regions at the end of it. Anyway, there was I would say, a good and healthy spirit of cooperation and collaboration, more so than most probably envisioned even before the consolidation. But I personally think it was inevitable and good for the Corps, good for the Army, and good for DOD.
Sir, thank you so much. And once again, please give them applause for their participation. Ms. Sullivan, I turn it back over to you.
Wasn't that fantastic? I tell you, I've worked here for 39 years and I learned something new today from this discussion. Thank you so much. It is very critical to know where you came from in order to know and understand where you're going. So thank you, Dr. Whalen, thank you, Dr. Soterin and Dr. Roper. Let's give them one more round of applause. So at this time, we will take a short break and reconvene at 10:30 for our second panel discussion, Leadership Reflections, ERDC's Formation to Today. We have hostesses who will be serving celebratory cake in the atrium as well as popcorn, and our coffee shop has special 25th anniversary drinks for purchase. So everybody raise your right hand. I state your name.
I, Tim Reeves.
Promise to be back on time at 10:30. See you back at 10:30.
Our second panel discussion focuses on leadership reflections, the formation of ERDC to today. It is my privilege to introduce our next panelist, Dr. Ed Link, Director of R&D during 1998, Colonel Robin Kababa, ERDC's first commander, Dr. Jim Houston, ERDC's first director, Dr. Jeffrey Holland, ERDC director from 2010 to 2017, and Dr. David Pittman, our current ERDC director. Welcome to you all.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. Coercion may have worked in some cases, so I appreciate it so much. As discussed in the earlier panel, transitioning from 8 research laboratories to 1 ERDC was not easy. Dr. Link, we'll start with you. What do you remember about those early days of ERDC after it was activated?
Well, to quote Dr. Whalen, it turned out exactly as I envisioned. I have to admit, I'm a recovering public servant, and my therapy for that has been to stay connected with ERDC in any way I possibly can. So I'm expressing a vulnerability. If you ask me to help with something, I'm probably going to volunteer to do it. Dr. Whalen expressed the idea that DOD was infatuated with consolidations, and not only did that happen in the 80s, but in the late 90s, they were, again, seriously involved in plans to reduce the R&D structure. There were some good reasons behind that. It had grown beyond the budget that Congress was willing to spend. But also it had proliferated a lot of individual efforts going on, and that didn't necessarily promote productivity for the more complex and larger scope kinds of challenges that DOD was faced with, and the Corps, of course. So another initiative was developed within DOD and Mother Army to let's reduce the R&D infrastructure and let's make it more efficient, reduce cost, which, by the way, in Washington, that's the only metric that matters. And let's try to evolve the R&D infrastructure into something that'll better fit the future. The 8 laboratories in the Corps of Engineers were a really inviting target, especially for folks that were outside the Corps of Engineers. So basically, part of our challenge was how do we protect the integrity of the R&D capabilities, the very unique R&D capabilities that existed within the Corps of Engineer labs. And the other side of the coin was how many of these labs are we willing to give up if we want to comply with what the Army was asking us to do. So I guess in a nutshell, our philosophy was, in the beginning, we did have a plan, but it's like a recipe for sausage making. You don't always know what's going to come out at the end. But our recipe was, let's circle the wagons. I'm being very truthful now. Let's circle the wagons, and let's not look like we're 8 individual labs. Actually was the start of serious planning for how would we do this, and how would we make this, how would we preserve this phenomenal capability that existed, and oh, by the way, how can we make it even better? How might we set the core labs up to continue to serve, but to serve in over a larger scope, more complex problems that required the partnering between the capabilities that existed in the individual labs. So that was the start of the whole process. And again, it was sausage making. We had a recipe. We started down that road, and with all of the great ideas and the continual meeting, as Dr. Soterin implied, those ideas began to get sorted out. which ideas were the ones that were valid, which ideas were the ones that we should shove under the rug. And the evolution from there, it was strictly just on the backs of all of the leadership of the labs. This did, and I left Barbara with no budget at Krell evidently when I left Krell. I didn't, when we hired her to be the next director at Krell, we didn't tell her that she had no budget. But it was a big turmoil in the labs. It was a disruption for everyone could see that this might be a disruption to their career and to their livelihood and so on. What's the future? A lot of uncertainty. What's the future going to be? And it was the strength of the commitment of the lab directors and the subordinate management in the labs that pulled this through and began to put it together into one integrated program that today is just something that is hard to describe how wonderful it is, how productive it is, and how impactful it is for the nation. So it was largely an evolution, and that evolution is still going on today. And thanks to you, it's been a big success.
Colonel Kababa, you were part of that combining as well, and I can get other comments as well, but mainly I wanted to start with you as well.
Well, let me add to what Dr. Link said. You have to recall the times we were in at that time. It was not only there was pressure to consolidate the labs, but the Corps of Engineers was under a mandate at that time to reduce the number of divisions from 11 to 8. And that was in law. And so the Corps had to make some drastic changes in how it operated. And the follow-on, once the Corps reduced those 3 divisions, took those down, is that the labs then became the next target. The labs became lucrative in the sense that it was, they were just very visible and very separate. So it's something that was bound to happen, as Dr. Whalen said, because it was time and it was visible. And to get in front of it, the lab directors and the commanders said we needed to do something. We started these meetings that Dr. Link had. And what was funny was the first meeting, I went up with Dr. Wayland, and we were meeting at Searle. And the lab directors and myself, we all showed up in what I'm wearing today. Red tie, blue shirt, blue blazer, gray trousers. Searle showed up in blue blazers, khaki trousers. It was unbelievable how different we were dressed, okay? Krell showed up, frankly, some of them showed up with flannel shirts. Okay, and ETL showed up as in Brooks Brothers suits, okay, which is the standard uniform in Washington, D.C. It was that group of people, though, that came together. And a couple of things came out of that first meeting. And the first one that came out, and this is on the commander's side, is that we could not end up with 4 separate sites. We had to end up with one integrated organization. So there wasn't going to be anybody like site managers. There was going to be an integrated support structure that was going to come from all of the different labs. And that, I think, helped build a cohesive, integrated organization. And as Dr. Link said, did we know what we were doing at the time? We were guessing. But I think we guessed pretty well. We did.
I don't want to cut the conversation short. Does anybody else want to have comments before we move on to the next question? Dr. Houston, Holland, Tucker?
What was the question?
The question was the first days of ERDC, the conversations. Is what do you remember from those first days?
When we first started talking about ERDC? Well, at the time, I didn't know that much about what was happening at the national level or the DOD level because I was a simple lab director. I was director of the Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory, and we were predominantly civil works, 95% civil works. We didn't overlap the other labs. You know, Krell did a little bit of work with water, but they had ice in the water, so. And so, for me, the ERDC was a good idea. You know, I was used to all the labs reporting to a single director at the time. I thought more labs, it's going to even be stronger. And I also knew that civil works wasn't going away, so I wasn't too worried about on the military side where some labs might be merged with others or go away. It just wasn't an issue. So I thought the ERDC was going to be a great thing. It didn't bother me a bit. It did bother me. It took a long time to get it going. And Barbara Soderin mentioned we had meetings, lab directors. Those were every month. And so that kind of drove me crazy. But and then the only other thing I have to say, I am wearing a Brooks Brothers suit because Debbie Quimby told me to wear a suit and tie. This would be my normal outfit.
I'm scared to keep working down the line, but please,
Feel free.
Dr. Holland?
Well, you know, I was in the lab, and what was interesting was that people were writing their own structures of ERDC by this time, circulating their own boxes. Everyone in this room was the head of ERDC or the commander at least once during that time period. The head, ERDC was going to be in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and Ed was going to be in charge of it. You know, it's the rumor mill was more ridiculous than the normal. The grapevine is usually fairly accurate inside the organization, interestingly enough. But during that time period, these fine people would disappear and go into the abyss. And when they would come back, they would appear to know less than they did when they went in. As if somehow the Borg had assimilated them.
Sir, Dr. Pittman?
Well, okay, so I was a division chief, so I was even lower than a lab director, and it wasn't playing down in the labs the way that it must have been happening in those meeting rooms. I'm telling you, we were scared to death. I mean, we were going to get eaten up, you know. So I appreciate what Dr. Soderman was saying. You know, Wes grabbing Krell. I think we all thought, you know, what's going to come of this? So it was. I think we were just kind of looking with interest at what was going to happen, and a little bit scared, honestly.
Colonel Kababa, the next question is for you. While the formation of many research lab responsibilities and some structures fell to the lab directors and Dr. Link at the time, you were charged with building out the inner workings and support organizations, the critical infrastructure of what would become ERDC. Walk us through the time of getting ERDC's structure organized and talk about the role your deputy, Joe Roberto, played in that formation.
Well, to this day, I still don't know what Dr. Link's macro plans were.
We're learning them, right?
Oh, I'd forgotten that term.
He would talk about these macro plans on how we would integrate the labs. But then, for the support structure, we had already determined that we're not going to have site managers, which meant that what we concentrated on was how do we get to an integrated organization where facilities were managed as one, where resources were managed as one, where human resources managed as one. And those things were relatively hard to do because some of them those concepts of distributed management was a new concept in the Army at the time. Human resources, for example, or contracting, was essentially geographically based. And so trying to create these support structures that would encompass all of the sites, all of the labs, all of the works was something that was new and different. Now, looking back on it 25 years, much of industry, much of the Army, much of DOD is in a distributed structure now. But this was one of the first times that an organization, a military organization, was being changed so that it wasn't geographic centered. And that was kind of exciting for us to do. It was different, and we actually depended a lot on systems and communications that, at that time, were not yet invented. But now you can do all of this stuff through your phone. But at that time, we were trying to figure out how you do it through modems with telephones. But it was, the principal concept was no site managers, full integration, and whatever adherence we needed to do with Dr. Link's macro plans. And one of these days he will tell me what those meant.
Sir, before I move on to the next question, last night you and I talked about you have 2 plaques on the wall outside from being the last commander at West and the first commander at ERDC. It'd been nice if they had done 2 separate photos, but that's okay. It's a beautiful first photo. But speaking of photos, there's one I would like to put up on the screen for a second, if they can do it. This is something. Sir, I just want to know.
I told you I was scared.
What did Dr. Pittman do, and how long of a trouble was he?
Hey, I had green slacks on. Y'all see that?
So I want to let you know that we never failed any experiment at all, ever when I was here, except this one. You see the lack of smiles? I actually don't know what that picture is. I thought that's a good story.
I'm smiling. Wow.
Let me add one other thing. Vicksburg is normally hot and humid, so I would usually jog in the morning at 4:30 around the campus. And the first time I met Dr. Pittman, the pavements tester, you know that big machine with the tires that roll back and forth? I hear that machine going on, so I tie my dog to a lamppost. And I walk in, and here's Dr. Pittman with a clipboard, and he's counting the times his wheel is going back and forth. This is at 4 in the morning. Okay? That's when I got to meet him, and we discussed what kind of experiment he was doing. It actually ended up being something that I saw in the military later on, but it was, this was my first meeting with him.
I didn't know we got a picture of that encounter, by the way.
Sir, we have the hard copy for you later.
Okay, all right, very good.
Tim, before you go, the question about Joe Roberto, though,
Oh, I'm sorry, yes.
is one that I would think that either Ed or Jim,
Oh, please.
as Jim saw the impact that Joe Roberto had on the maturing of ERDC, I think perhaps we should address that because his contribution really over the maturing of ERDC can't be denied.
And having the deputy at Creel versus Vicksburg.
Sir?
So, Joe Roberto became the deputy to the commander. Again, a totally new position. And he and I worked together to set up what we call the commander's office. There are so many things that he did that I wasn't aware of, okay? But in the long run, when it did come to light, they were the right things to do to integrate the office. And he's one of the keys to the success of this early organization because he saw how the intent that we had, what we were trying to do, and every day he worked to make that happen. That's it.
And it's certainly true that had the support services not meshed, ERDC would have had no way of building from there. That was an essential part of ERDC beginning.
Yes.
I'd like to just say one thing. I did give Joe my macro plan. So.
He just never told his boss, see? He never told his boss.
And after Joe was my principal at Crell, and after he reorganized me at Crell, I figured he'd be great for the ERDC.
This next question seems to have been the one that drew the most interest. I know Colonel Kababa was wanting to make sure he understood the answers to this one. But Dr. Link, I understand it took a little time to convince Dr. Houston to become ERDC's first director. And how I phrase this may be I don't know, but how did you finally convince him he was the right person for the job? And we'll then get Dr. Houston's side of the story. So.
Well, it's really simple. I just had Smokin' Joe Ballard call him. General Ballard was very involved in a lot of the ERDC decisions. That's one way to say it. And he had some very specific objectives that were very good objectives. And being his director of R&D at the time, I got to talk to him about it a lot. He would call me many evenings and say, come on down to the office. And we'd sit there until all hours talking about whatever he wanted to talk about. But this was a favorite topic. He valued the labs. He at one time as a captain had been in a lab, not one of ours, an AMC lab. And so he really had a soft spot in his heart for maintaining the core R&D. Discussions were held about how do we, first of all, I was the acting director, and it became very obvious to me after about a year that this wasn't going to work, to have two jobs basically, both jobs semi-impossible to do. And so we started trying to lay out the criteria. What do we need? We need someone with integrity that all of ERDC would trust, and also in the line of the traits of a typical core lab director. That person needed to be technically respected, be an expert in something, and those were kind of the line. And oh, by the way, someone who would be willing to do what was best for the organization and the people of the organization. And we ended up with a list, but a fairly short list, and Jim was at the top of the list. When I first talked to Jim about it, I recall the phone call, and he said, "You got to be kidding." Oh, by the way, and I'll add another dimension to this. General Ballard felt that it was essential for ERDC's command structure to be in Washington. After all, that's where all the money is, right? So what does the leadership do? Well, they represent the research community for whoever will provide resources. So that was part of Jim's, "Oh, you ought to be kidding." So eventually, I'll make a long story a little shorter. General Ballard called Jim and said, "Jim, I think you should come I think you should be the director." And I think he can tell you what his response was. It was effectively, "You got to be kidding." And he used the excuse of, "Well, all I know is civil works, and most of what's going on in ERDC is military." Well, I can come to tell you that when I went to Krell, I was 18 years here in Vicksburg at West, and I walked in the door to the world's experts in low temperature, this and that. By the way, I used to tell Dr. Whalen that Krell took everything that West was doing, and we added thermodynamics. It wasn't just the words. So that was a bit of a change, because when I was asked by the chief to move to Washington from Krell, I said, "You got to be kidding. I'll protect your northern flank for the next 10 years if you just leave me here." So I understand where Jim was coming from. Going to Washington is not necessarily something that we all want to do after we've enjoyed being away from the flagpole like we are here up at Krell. But eventually, he came around. And I'll let him tell the rest of the story.
Yeah,
I'll share the real story.
because Dr. Lincoln got some of it right. But I'll tell you what really happened, because it touches on a lot of, lab directors wanted to know, why did it end up in Vicksburg and all this kind of stuff. And so I'll tell you what really happened. Most people don't realize the ERDC director position was originally advertised in Washington, D.C. I did not apply. Apparently, the chief got a list of people that did not satisfy him. Soon thereafter, there was a meeting of the senior leaders in the Corps, and the chief wanted to meet with all his members of senior executive service on a one-on-one and go through their performance. And the only thing I remember about that meeting is he looked at me sternly and he said, "Houston, why did you not apply for the position?" And I said, "Chief, I'm absolutely the wrong person for the position. As we've said, 95% of the work in coastal hydraulics was civil works. But ERDC was 3/4 military. I said, you need to get somebody in the military. I'm exactly the wrong person for the job." So he then looked at me even more sternly and said, "Are you just saying that because you don't want to go to Washington?" Now, my wife and I didn't want to go to Washington. It wasn't my only reason. I'm glad he put in the word "just," because I said, "No, Chief, I'm the wrong person for the position." He looked a little skeptical, but he didn't pursue it. That night, I called my wife, Fran, and said, "We've dodged the bullet. We're not moving to Washington." She didn't want me to take the position no matter where it was, by the way. Really, and I'll describe that a little later. But it was then advertised a second time in Washington. And apparently the chief got a list. Again, he didn't get the people he wanted, apparently, or thought could have the job. And I think Dr. Link was working on them, that maybe you ought to think of somewhere like Vicksburg. I mean, we had one core laboratory in the Washington, D.C. area, and 4 here in Vicksburg. It didn't work in Washington. Why don't we give it a shot here? So it was advertised here in Vicksburg. I did not apply. And for good reason. I thought about it, but I knew Fran thought I worked enough nights and weekends and traveling. She didn't want me to take the position, and I agreed with her. Besides which, when I thought about it, it didn't make sense. I came to Vicksburg as a draftee during the Vietnam War. After basic training, rather than the Vietnam, they sent me to Vicksburg. I didn't want to be in the Army, and I didn't want to be in Mississippi. But like a lot of people in the ERDC, I got captivated by the work. I was working on a PhD in physics, but here you actually worked with people and solved problems for customers. I really got into that. And so when I got out of the Army, I went back to school in engineering, and I stayed on. I was in the hydraulics lab for a dozen years. The Coastal Engineering Research Center was relocated from Washington down to Vicksburg, and eventually I became director of that laboratory. Then 10 years later, they merged the Coastal Engineering Center and the Hydraulics Laboratory to form the Coastal and Hydraulics Laboratory, and I was the first director. I knew everyone by their first name. It was my technical background. I had a PhD and master's degree in coastal and hydraulic engineering. So why would I want to go and take over the ERDC? It wasn't mentioned a lot, but let me tell you, a lot of the labs did not want to be part of the ERDC. This was going to be a headache to get them together. And remember, this is before 9/11. I thought a lot of the work done on the military side in those days was kind of boring. And I thought, you know, the research is more interesting in coastal and hydraulics lab, so I didn't want to take the position. Then I was in Washington in one of these monthly meetings out at Tech, and somebody came and said, "You've got a call from Dr. Link, not from General Ballard, Dr. Link." I got on, he said, "Jim, General Ballard wants you to become the director of ERDC." And so I said, "Well, Ed, you know, that's very nice. You know, it's a great thing to be asked to be in that position, but I don't want to do it." And then Ed said, "Well, Jim, I told the chief that's exactly what you were going to say. You were going to turn down the position." He said, "But the words that I used, the chief would like you to become," Ed said, "were his words." When he said that to General Ballard said, either he takes the position or he retires, he gets out of the Corps of Engineers. He said, "I'll make it happen." and if you knew General Ballard, you knew he could. I was 52 years old. I wasn't even the minimum retirement age. Even then, I said to Ed, "Listen, could I call you back in a few minutes? I need to talk with my wife, Fred, because I know she's against it because I work so much now. This would be, and travel. You know, I was traveling all the time then as a lab director." And I talked with her, and we realized, you know, we didn't have much choice. We weren't going to wait for, you know, a horse's head to appear in our... And so that's when I agreed to become director. Now, what I'm telling you is how stupid I was, because it ended up to be by far the most consequential position I've ever been in. A wonderful position, because you realize a year later you had 9/11, then you had the global war on terror, the war in Afghanistan, the war in Iraq, and ERDC was right in the middle of all of that because of our expertise, in particular protecting soldiers from rockets and mortars and rocket-propelled grenades, and then later on IEDs. And we started working with other laboratories. It's no wonder, you know, my last 5 years as director, we were Army Research Laboratory of the Year 4 out of the 5 years, and we also won soon after 9/11. ERDC was the excellent lab, and one of the reasons is because of this entrepreneurship where we're working for customers. You got to come up with a solution that's not in the distance. You can do it now at a reasonable cost. It's effective. Other Army laboratories were typically working on future combat systems, you know, the future, which never actually occurred. And we were the ones to solve the problems right now, and that really helped us win an Army Lab of the Year. I was really proud of being the director, and it was in other areas too. The environmental area, you know, environmental lands, civil works, endangered species, invasive species, all the labs started working together because in those areas, just like the military area, you had to they were different disciplines together to solve problems. And so ERDC did terrific work. I'm glad General Ballard made me take the position. And it wasn't, oh, gee whiz, no. I try my best not to have it.
And sir, we're going to have to skip some of the questions just for time because we know we have a special guest at 11:30, but we're going to try to go to the next one, and we're going to maybe go to Dr. Holland, Dr. Pittman, come around as well. It's well documented that early in ERDC's time, it was not one ERDC, one team, as we say today. Dr. Pittman has often said the events of September 11th kind of forged what is ERDC today. Dr. Holland, Dr. Houston, Dr. Pittman, could y'all discuss the events of that day and how ERDC really became ERDC at that point? Dr. Holland, you can start.
So, 9/11 for many of you is a seminal event. You know where you were, you know what you were doing. The generation before many of you take the JFK assassination as that particular day. But the point is 9/11 is a time you don't forget. I was sitting here watching the monitors here in CHL, watching things fly, watching the reports. And this organization was already busy doing the mission that was associated with what we would continue to do as it related to the things of protecting people that came out of 9/11. What happened, though, was that because of the extraordinary emergency that existed, not only for our troops, but for literally all of the infrastructure of this country, and the incredible amount of money that existed, there were people that were hoping and praying that somebody in this country had the ability to do something that protected them if they were going to continue to go to work, if they were going to run the government, if people were going to drive from one side of a bridge to another. And this was true everywhere in the country. And the truth is one of the main places in the entire nation that had that capability was the ERDC. Did people know that we had that capability? No. In fact, the people in this town of Vicksburg don't today know that we have that capability. When I walk around and ask people, what does ERDC do? Most of them say that we work on the Mississippi River and that we just run around inside the gates out here and make sure that we have guards to keep any of them from coming in and seeing what we're doing.
Nailed it.
And we used to have public tours when they were younger, but we stopped that because some of them did get in and figured out what we were doing, so we had to make sure that we didn't let them in. But if you look at how we were positioned, I don't know if it was the grace of God or if it was great planning or if it was macro plans. I'm pretty sure it wasn't the last one.
Come on now, come on.
Well, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
But we had capabilities that other people didn't have, and we had that piece of the ingredient that Jim mentioned, which was that we were used to taking things to solution in a hurry, which not everybody can claim to be able to do. Most universities, for example, don't do that at all. The 6-1 laboratories do not work at that speed. And the parts of you that work on these kinds of problems know that the people that were interested in IED solutions wanted them right then, not 18 months from now, not 36 months from now. We were reading things in the press where at that particular time, more people were dying in bivouac areas, more of our soldiers were being killed in bivouac areas from random rocketry than were being killed in the battle space on any given day. That's what was going on. And so we started generating solutions, and people found out that we had those solutions. Now, it was also an interesting time for us that it drew parts of CREL, parts of Searle, parts of Tech, and particularly parts of GSL together with ITL. And once the people started working together, there were no longer issues. I don't know if it's that the distrusted part of the organization is its leadership, and I'll take responsibility for that. It was Jim.
Very good.
Okay, or what it was, but once relationships were formed, there were never any issues after that. At least it didn't seem to me. People work together. Ed,
I have a very recent anecdote to reflect for you. Last week, my wife and I were in Croatia, and we happened to be there with Major General Hans Van Winkle, who was the deputy commander of the Corps during 9/11. And Hans was, we were, the other parts of our party were senior members of the past in the Civil Works program and headquarters, Fred Caver, Steve Stockton, and part of our travel group. And Hans was telling them about 9/11. And we also talked about the Sava River because Hans was in Serbia during the Sava River and Bosnia conflict. And part of the conversation was when the planes hit the Pentagon, and by the way, I was supposed to be in the Pentagon that morning talking to General Van Antwerp in his office, and thank God he left town the day before and I didn't get to go. But when the planes hit, it was immediately necessary to get somebody in there to determine if it was safe for the rescue teams to go in. So get that? Before the rescue teams. And Hans said, I had to call on the labs to do it. And Paul Malacher was one of those individuals that went. And within hours, that team was in the Pentagon, in the basement where the plane hit. They found the nose wheel of that aircraft inside the third ring of the Pentagon in the basement. So that was quite a testimony to how fast ERDC can react in very critical situations. And it happened last week.
Before we move on, I want to get Dr. Pittman's thoughts on that as well.
So the reason, and I think we all agree that 9/11, it changed the world, and it changed ERDC. So we were, still storming Norman Foreman, as ERDC. We were kind of grumbling about, why do we become ERDC? We're still navel gazing, I would call it. And then 9/11 happened. By the way, that day I happened to be at Disney World with my kids, and all they could think about, Daddy, why aren't we going to Magic Kingdom? I said, sweetie, they shut it down. They did, seriously. So, but that day it changed the world, right? And so the story behind the story, and Dr. Houston's told this story a lot, is that people in this room, Reed Moser, Paul Malacher, Robert Hall, Bart Durst, a lot of people in this room, and a lot of people who's retired, had developed protective technologies that had been embedded in the walls of the Pentagon, and they'd almost completed it. So when that airplane hit, it was actually a gruesome real-life experiment in a way that one half of that wall that had been hit had not been retrofitted with the technologies yet. The other half had. And so when the fuselage penetrated 3 of the rings of the Pentagon, the wings blew up like truck bombs, which is what that protection had been designed to prevent, deaths from truck bombs. And so hundreds of lives were actually saved that day on the side that had been retrofitted. They found that story out. CBS News found that story. We knew that. Reed knew that. I mean, then we started finding out inside of ERDC that had happened that day. And within 30 days, they featured Reed Moser, Michael Connor, who was the director of GSL at that time, on 60 Minutes, telling that story. And they showed a man, you can Google this, it's still on there. He had a bandage around his head and a tear in his eye, and he was explaining how the work that the engineers had saved his life that day and hundreds of people that day. And that's when we knew what we now call today the power of ERDC. We didn't worry about who had what and who's doing what anymore. We had a reason, a powerful reason to work together and literally save lives. That, to me, that's what started the whole thing. And we've done a lot more since then, but that was that galvanizing moment, not just for the world, but for ERDC itself.
Speaking of another inflection point, a point that changed ERDC and the research that's done here was Hurricane Katrina.
Yes.
At that time, we were another devastating event. Dr. Houston, if you'll start this conversation, how did that storm and its aftermath shape what was going to be the future of ERDC's civil works research?
Well, it's pretty much like everyone said. It galvanized everyone, not just in the ERDC, where ERDC labs working together. We started working with other Army laboratories, with Navy laboratories, because the problems were complex and solutions had to be done quickly, as fast as we could. And we got into areas like IEDs, where we worked with, for example, the night vision lab. I don't think we'd ever worked with much before. And if you remember at the beginnings, every time you open a newspaper, it was so many soldiers had been killed by IEDs this year. And that was continuous. But then at some point, all of a sudden you start hearing less and less and less. And that was because of ERDC and the other Army laboratories and Navy laboratories, Navy Research Laboratory we did a lot of work with, had come up with ways to pretty much defeat IEDs. And you didn't hear that much about IEDs after that. And there were other similar examples where the ERDC solved just major problems. It worked with other laboratories. It worked internally to figure out how to do it, because all the problems were interdisciplinary. You needed all kinds of different teams. And it wasn't a question of, this lab, that lab. It was, how in the world are we going to solve this problem? And we need to solve the problem fast because it's a big problem and troops are dying. I'd give you another example, the MRAP, that's the giant truck that worked against IEDs, but we kind of solved the IED problem. But in Afghanistan, what they were doing is there were culverts all over the place. Almost every road with culvert, they were loading it with high explosives, and the truck would go over it and it would blow up. And in a period of 6 months, there were about 50 soldiers that had serious back injuries, typically broken backs because of what happened. ERDC started working that problem, and we started working with others, and eventually figured out what to do about it, so it stopped happening, and then you never heard about it again. And that's typically the case. Or at the very beginning of the war, did most people realize in Iraq most of our troops were in portable homes, portable mobile homes? We had mobile home giant areas, and they were being whacked by mortars. The mortar would come, go right through the roof, explode inside, kill everybody. And we had to come up with something that was feasible and quick, and ERDC came up, well, they were really smart. Mortars are slightly indented, fused, it's slightly indented, and what we figured out is if it hit something like wood, like just plywood, it would suck up enough plywood to pre-detonate. And so we took all the mobile homes, put a thin layer of metal in order to stop the fragments, but then just regular plywood. They would come down, they pre-detonate, explode, the fragments wouldn't get in, and then the enemy stopped using mortars because it wasn't effective anymore. There are many, many stories like that. It's kind of unbelievable, but it was triggered by 9/11 and the global war on terrorism.
So I forgot to apologize for not getting back to you on that question beforehand, but if we could get back to the change in Katrina afterwards and how ERDC, what you saw beyond that, Dr. Holland, Dr. Pittman, and others, how that continued to shape ERDC moving forward.
Well, Katrina is another one of those seminal events that explodes us again in terms of our technological capability. Katrina takes parts of almost every lab, if not every lab, and highlights and really creates a great deal of rigor in each of those laboratories. Again, somebody like Reed Mosier gets grabbed up in that as it relates to exactly what are the forensics of the failure mechanisms that went on 19th Street Levee. It takes 32 years of Reed's life over the next 3 years to be able to work that. That causes Reed to think that becoming the director of a laboratory is better than what he's doing. That's how bad it was. Okay. we put enormous resources into that capability inside of each of the laboratories to be able to attack that problem. And I think what we saw, and if we didn't, sort of shame on us, is that the whole of ERDC is much greater than the sum of the parts. Much greater. The problems that are going to come to an organization like this are multidisciplinary problems. The single discipline problem is gone. People are not going to bring single discipline problems to us in general. They're going to take those someplace else. They can take them to a university. But those multidisciplinary problems are the ones that are fun. They're the ones that other people can't do. We want to do them. We want people that want to do them. So Katrina was a perfect example of the true multidisciplinary problem. You've got Don Riccio and his entire team on one side figuring out things that others hadn't figured out related to the hurricane effects and exactly how those were going to promulgate into wave action and how those wave actions are affecting shallow shelf issues coming into a place like New Orleans and what that really means to New Orleans. All of that went into what became a, $11 billion?
Yep. 16.
How much?
16 billion, I think.
Yeah.
15.7.
15.7, yeah.
Okay.
So Ed would know. Ed would know.
Okay. Lots of money. Okay. But it was essential that those numbers be as correct as they were capable of being inside of a risk framework. So the risk framework then is one that EEL had been working, that CHL had been working.
Yeah.
GSL brings mechanics to that problem. The piece parts are all in there. Those piece parts have to be meshed, they have to be integrated and then explained, which was the most, in the end, the most essential part of the whole thing. That changes our paradigm of how we do business.
Dr. Link, you had something to say?
Yeah, I was sort of a little bit involved in
You think?
Katrina.
A little bit.
So when the chief asked me to be the director of the task force that did the forensic analysis in New Orleans, I thought, this is not a one-person job. And so immediately, we had set up 10 teams to analyze the various aspects, and Jeff has done a good job of talking about some of those critical areas. But I had to pick leaders. Now, I'm at the University of Maryland by then. I had gone on to try to create engineers. And I had to find leadership for that team, but we had to be an independent from the Corps task force. We didn't work for anybody except the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works thought we worked for him. But for each of those 10 teams, we chose one person from the Corps and one person from outside the Corps to co-lead those teams. And the strategy behind that was get the expertise that we know exists, people that really know the Corps and know what these problems are, and get the outside expertise as part of the team to maintain an independence and a view of this wasn't a whitewash analysis by the Corps, because General Strzok was under a lot of pressure for that. Reed played about 6 different roles. Bruce Ebersol from Chill was one of the team leaders. Mike, who did this? Yeah, did the centrifuge work.
Oh,
By the
Mike
way,
Sharp.
Mike Sharp. And we ended up using Dr. Whalen's favorite big toy, the biggest centrifuge in the world.
Yes.
To visualize and demonstrate the failure mechanisms that were being discovered by the analytical work, but that centrifuge allowed us to create videos and show Congress, here's how these things failed, and here's why these things failed. But in all, I had 300 people on that task force. About 150 were from the Corps. and about 149 of those were from ERDC. And so a lot of the leadership positions were filled by ERDC, and a whole lot of even Ty had a real job at that time, and he was doing hurricanes with Riccio. So it was an immense contribution that you made to that across the board. And we had 25 universities involved, we had 12 federal agencies, we had 25 companies involved. But everywhere you looked in that team, ERDC was there. And ERDC was a prominent piece of it. And the piece of what we had to do there that's not always obvious is that we started that work in September of 2005, and we had to be done by June of 2006.
Whoa.
Okay, so we did that complete analysis, or the first draft of that complete analysis, so that we would have results in the ground before the next hurricane season came along in New Orleans. Now that's a time frame for an analysis and an execution of the results that I'm not sure has ever been repeated before. And that was possible because of you.
Sir, the toughest job of moderating is having to delete, like, I don't know, 20 questions that I had. And especially when you have someone like the special guest who is just about ready for us. And so I'm going to leave out most of ERDC's history here in the next little bit. But I will want to end it with Dr. Pittman here as we get ready for the next guest. And sir, the ERDC of yesterday is not the ERDC of today. It's not the ERDC of tomorrow. Can you talk about ERDC's future and how the research it is doing now is paving the way for the future?
Yes. So everybody in ERDC probably knows this, the folks that haven't been around maybe for a few years. We have a brand new R&D strategy. It's called the Army Corps of Engineers R&D strategy. I've talked to a lot of ERDC folks about this. But this Chief of Engineers, who's about to speak here in a minute, I think, General Spelman, really believes in R&D and the power of R&D to cause the Corps to innovate. We got $91 billion program and growing. We got to innovate to deliver that program, and our workforce isn't growing that much. So he really believes in the power of R&D, the power of ERDC, to help deliver that program, right? Do it faster, cheaper, better, safer than ever before. So he led the charge to write an R&D strategy that features the top 10 R&D priorities of the Corps. Now, believe it or not, we've been around since 1775. We've never had a comprehensive R&D strategy across all mission areas, civil works, military programs, and everything, warfighter support, everything. So, for instance, mitigating and adapt to climate change. Secretary Austin said that is the existential threat, for the world. So no matter if you're doing civil works or military programs or warfighter support, we're doing things to help do that today. Some called forecast informed reservoir operations, for instance, where we're predicting where water is going to go before it ever hits the ground. That's helping to preserve scarce resources like water in California, for instance. Something called engineering with nature, where we're building resiliency. We're helping to rebuild Tyndall Air Force Base right now in Florida, using those same principles and concepts for engineering with nature to build coastal resilience on a military installation. So I just had a chance to talk to the Chief of Staff of the Army. The Chief brought us up. We met the new Chief. I think it was confirmed yesterday, by the way, General Randy George. He's now the actual Chief of Staff of the Army. We talked to him about the Corps, and he said, tell me what's unique about the Corps. I said, sir, I'll tell you what's unique about ERDC. It's the people, and it's having these missions, and we'll discover a solution for one purpose on one side, on the military side, that hard concrete that we were talking about that took to protect these structures. We developed that for military purposes, but we'll take that same 30,000 PSI concrete and we'll start lining our lock walls on our navigation structures. Instead of having to tear it out and take months and millions of dollars to do it, now we can do it much shorter and much faster. But that developed from a military technology. On the same side, all that work we did in Hurricane Katrina, all those hurricane models and coastal modelings we developed for civil works purposes, we use that now for military purposes, logistics over the shore. The Marines are literally using that right now for planning logistics over the shore operations in the future. So I said, sir, Chief of Staff of the Army, that's the power of ERDC, sir. That is the power. Nobody does that. And the same person working this military problem, by the way, the next day they'll be working on a civil works program and vice versa. So having that diversity of mission and experience and that interdisciplinary nature of how we solve problems, that's what makes us unique, I think. That's the power of ERDC.
Sir, thank you. And again, I'm sorry for cutting the conversation short, but if we can please give them a round of applause for their... And turn it back over to Ms. Sullivan.
Thank you, gentlemen. I knew this discussion would be very informative and entertaining, having worked with all of you over the years. Let's give all of our panelists another round of applause. And I'd like to personally express our appreciation for you sharing your time and your memories with us today. Our future is certainly bright thanks to the contributions of these men and women. At this time, we are extremely privileged to have a special guest joining us virtually from Washington, D.C., a person we hold in high esteem and who juggled a very tightly packed schedule today to ensure that he could speak with us. It is my honor to introduce Lieutenant General Scott Spellman, the 55th Chief of Engineers and the Commanding General of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Let's welcome General Spellman.
Hey, good morning, everyone. First, Pat, can I just get a thumbs up? Can you hear me okay?
Yes, sir.
And oh, great. All right, it's working. All right. Well, first of all, after that very generous introduction, I have to be good now. So first of all, good morning, everyone. And just let me begin by extending my personal, my heartfelt, and my sincere congratulations to our great team at ERDC for this significant milestone in your history. I really appreciate the opportunity just to provide a few brief comments today. This milestone really is something to celebrate, and I wish I could be down here in Vicksburg with all of you. I really just enjoyed listening there to Dr. Link and Dr. Holland and the other panel members as we get started today. You all have to know that you are part of an organization that's unlike anything in the entire world, and I'm going to tell a story about that here in a moment. But our ERDC team, it gets to do things, it gets to go places, it gets to meet extraordinary people, not only in this country, but around the world, things that the rest of us just can't do, not even me. And I think most of you know, like most chiefs, I have been pushing our organization to think differently, right? Think differently about the challenges that we face. And all of you, you get to work in that environment each and every day because you thrive on thinking differently. You look at problems from new perspectives and different lenses. You engage with the best developers, the best scientists, and the engineers from around the world. And I just have to say, you know, for the last 25 years, our team at ERDC has established a tradition of innovation. Dr. Pittman, I can't think of a better theme for this anniversary, but it's that tradition that's driven and pushed this organization, not just this organization, in the Army, in ways that further strengthens our nation and our soldiers to be the best force in the world. And I can't say it enough. The innovation that comes out of ERDC, it is the future of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. And from Dr. Pittman on down, each of you continue to deliver engineering solutions, not only for the Army Corps of Engineers' toughest challenges, but our nation's toughest challenges. And whether it is creating new bunkers out in the Middle East to reduce the risk of traumatic brain injury, which you recently did for our soldiers, to implementing engineering with nature solutions on our nation's coastlines and rivers, all the work during Katrina and 9/11 that the panel just talked about, to redirecting rivers in North Dakota on one of our award-winning projects up there in Fargo, North Dakota. And even, I would say, for the work that's surfacing, Dr. Pittman will share that with you, the work that's surfacing for ERDC just this week in Ukraine. It's the work that you do, it's the work that you lead in Mississippi, in Illinois, in New Hampshire, and Virginia, and at field locations around the world that represents the very foundation of our ingenuity. What's more impressive, though, is that for all the remarkable achievements that you've accomplished over the past quarter of a century, you're just getting started. You really are. I was in the Everglades this week. I was out in Western Everglades, just got back last night and met with the Miccosukee tribes, members of the Seminole Tribe of Florida, and then our great partners in South Florida Water Management District. And David, I haven't had a chance to follow up with you yet, But those are normally contentious meetings for me. They were not this week. Great sessions, and they were singing the praises of the Engineering Research and Development Center for all the work that you're doing on aquifer storage and recovery wells, for the work that you're doing down there on harmful algal blooms. It is getting noticed by our partners and elected leaders throughout the state. I just returned within the last hour from a ceremony over at the Department of Interior with Secretary Holland. It was celebrating a new agreement, a 20-year agreement with the upper Columbia River tribes and some of the work that we're going to step out and do on our dams and hydroelectric power plants out on the Columbia River Basin. That work would not happen if it weren't for all the foundation work that you have been doing for many, many years on those projects. So we just can't thank you enough. Okay, just a few numbers for you. Last March, the president requested $86 million for research and development in his 24 budget and an additional $16 million for, I think we call it associated R&D activities across all of our business line. And this was an effort to get us on a path back to where we were back in the early 80s when I believe we were investing about 2.5%. We're on a path to get back there. I cannot share the numbers for 25 budget yet. I will tell you that Secretary Connor and I were with OMB leadership last week doing our agency head brief, and I'll just be happy to tell you that we are on a good trajectory to maintain that momentum in resourcing all that you do. And I'll tell you, you already know this. You don't need to hear it from me. It's already having a positive impact, and I'll just tell, we need you now more than ever, everyone in the room there, because as we look ahead, not at the last 25 years, but at the next 25 years, the future chapters of the Army Corps of Engineers and our R&D program, it won't be written in the halls of Congress or in boardrooms up at OMB or in the Secretary's office. It's going to be written by all of you out in the field. And that's why I say you're our nation's most talented workforce, and we just need your visionary minds hard at work. So let me just end with this quick story, and I apologize, Dr. Pittman's heard it once or twice already, but I don't think everyone in the room has heard it. We were at a cabinet meeting 2 weeks ago. Every once in a while, the chief of engineers gets invited to a cabinet meeting, and this was on Maui recovery. And so it was in the half the cabinet was in the room, in the Roosevelt room right outside the Oval Office, and the other half was on virtual. And so I was in there with Secretary of Defense Austin and General Milley, and the president was going around the room talking about what all the different federal agencies are doing to help with Maui recovery. It came our turn, and we walked him through all the things that we're doing for debris removal and temporary emergency power. And we're building a new school for 700 students down there. And then he went to the other cabinet secretaries. And at the end, the president was very appreciative. He got up to leave. He concluded the meeting. He got up to leave, and he started headed out of the Roosevelt room back into the Oval Office. And right at the door of the Oval Office, he stopped, he turned around, and he looked at everyone still in the room. He said, "I just want to say thank you to the Army Corps of Engineers. You are the best at what you do, and I really mean that. There is no one else like you in the world." And the guy went back to the Oval Office. And so General Milley looked at me and said, "Well, you don't have too many meetings that end like that." I said, "General Milley, I never have meetings that end like that." So, but I would just say that ERDC is a big part of being the best in the world. And I just wanted to share that story with you because you are a huge part of this organization and one of our premier programs that we have. So let me just end there. Happy anniversary to everybody at ERDC. I want you to really enjoy this day, celebrate, and then get back to pushing us hard to thinking differently about our mission. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for all you do. SAONs, building strong and be all you can be.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. You are a champion for innovation and R&D, and we truly appreciate your continued support of ERDC and its mission for USACE, our warfighter, and our nation. That was great. This concludes today's program, but I have a couple of housekeeping notes for you before we let you go. I want to ask that our panelists, former commanders and lab directors, retirees, team members in attendance today, that means everybody, please join us in the atrium for a group photo before lunch. And there will be people in the atrium to help you get in line for the photo. And then we want everybody included, I mean everybody. After the photo, we want to invite our in-person audience to join us for lunch at one of 3 locations. We have Cafe Paradiso coffee shop that's right off the atrium, the ERDC cafeteria. If you take a left past the coffee shop, you will find the ERDC cafeteria. And then we also have a food truck, Miller's Restaurant food truck, that will be in front, directly in front of this building, for your lunch options. So to everyone, I want to give a huge shout out also to our virtual team members in attendance. We see you there. Thank you. And thank you everyone for joining us today. One thing that I can say for sure is that our past has been grand, but the best is yet to come. Happy 25th, everybody. Let's go line up for the photo.